Imagine a species so stubborn they turned the impossible into reality. Meet the Terrans and their mind-bending journey through space. From a single scientist warping the fabric of the universe to a tower-shaped ship jumping across stars, this tale is packed with anomalies that'll leave you questioning everything. Buckle up for a wild ride through hyperdynamics, tenacity, and the genius of Mitchell James Paragon. Space will never look the same. Just a quick reminder before we get started. Only 4% of my viewers have subscribed to the channel so far. If you enjoy the content, I'd really appreciate it if you could take a moment to hit that subscribe button and support the channel. Thank you so much. Now start amazing story.
What is space? I don't mean the blackness between stars, but the very fabric that composes it. What do we mean by the term space? Great minds use terms like dimensionality, but that is simply shifting the burden of definition down a notch. So let us stick to the question at hand. Space is the relationship between things. People, places, points. With only one point, we have no idea of space, because there is nothing to relate to. Space only becomes tangible, recognizable, when we add a second point. 2 points form a line. The single dimension of space between them defines their relationship. Add a third nonlinear point, and we form a plane. Add a fourth nonplanar point, and we form a volume, from 1 dimension to 2 to 3. Space is defined by these relationships. But what if we take a line and connect the ends? We form a circle. Our 2 points, still separated by the same value in 1 dimension, can, through manipulation in a second dimension, be placed on top of each other. What seems separated in 1 dimension can be closed in a 2-dimensional manipulation. What about a plane? Again, we can curve the plane back on itself in the shape known as a Mobius strip and connect any 2 points on the 2-dimensional shape using a third dimension. And what of a volume? This is harder to grasp, but using a 4-dimensional extrusion, a Penrose triangle, we can similarly close a 3-dimensional space. So what we see is that our definition of space is limited by our perception of it. If we can see differently, we can move differently. Pause. Those words were written by Terran Dr. Mitchell James Paragon. There is a joke some of you may have heard in your hyperdynamics classes. It goes, "The only sentients to truly comprehend. Space are the Desics and Mitch Paragon, and the Desics are easier to understand." Laughter. Permit me to recap. We have 3 Terran anomalies so far. First, that life even arose on their planet in the first place. Second, Terran morality, arising without any inherent motivation. And third, the Grand Tour and the Terran discovery of the galactic civilization before discovering FTL. As I said last time, that discovery did not destroy Terran society. Of course, it threw most of the political groups into chaos for several years, but that was only at the upper levels of their governments. What ended up happening was something of a surprise, assuming you don't know Terran psychology. Luckily, we do. We already mentioned how Terran allegiances are artificial, and can and do shift on a whim. What those 2 days of recordings from the Voyager probes did was create a new dynamic on Earth. Prior to those signals, Terrans could only measure themselves in comparison to other Terrans. If there were any dichotomy, any us versus them, Terrans were on both sides. Now, though, the species became actively and uncontestably aware of something outside their species. There was a new them on the scene, all those races out in the galaxy. And suddenly, in balance, us became all Terrans. The kind of social transition that normally takes a less violent, more amenable species 30-40 octos to accomplish happened over a single octo. The species already had a rudimentary form of planetary government. Suddenly, this largely ceremonial body became the central clearinghouse for all information and discoveries. Terran political groups were still competing, but no longer for resources or territory. Now they raced for scientific and technological advancement, with the caveat that every new achievement, every new discovery, was sent back to be shared by all and form the basis for the next leap. The recordings had shown traces of vessels traveling between the stars. Now that they knew unconditionally that it was possible, Terrans raced to figure out how. There were 3 main focuses of effort. The first was on faster-than-light travel itself. Terrans had already come up with some basic ideas for this, but lacked any means to achieve them. The primary FTL focus was on something they called the Alcubierre drive, a basic form of the slipstream drive most species use. The second effort was on artificial gravity, a subject which they assumed to be possible but had no real tangible science towards. The third was on energy shielding, which the Terrans decided they'd need not for combat purposes, but simply to protect them out beyond their heliosphere. Their FTL drive was the most advanced area of study. Records show that 5 octos after Voyager 2's transmission, the Terrans were almost ready to test their Alcubierre drive. And then the fourth Terran anomaly happened. A Terran male by the name of Mitchell James Paragon had been working on the issue of artificial gravity, which at the time was the least advanced technology Terrans had. In fact, it could easily be said that they were literally dozens of octos behind other subjects. Terran science at least had the basics for FTL drives and potentially energy shielding, but there were no fundamental theories that could be used for gravity manipulation. They had an inkling of gravitons, but no idea of how to manipulate or redirect them. From what we know, Paragon selected this as his field of study specifically because of the lack of progress, and in the attitudes of the time, even lack of hope at making progress. He once quoted another famous Terran by saying that he chose gravitics not because it is easy, but because it is hard. That statement should tell you much of what you could ever want to know about Terran psychology in the face of adversity. Laughter from audience. You laugh, but this is no joke. Terran tenacity and success in spite of tremendous odds is the entire focus of this course. That phrase has been invoked as the final essay prompt for this class more than once. You would do well to remember it. To resume the history, Paragon solved the gravitational manipulation issue in a way that was so unique among species that hyperdynamics still refers to P fields in his honor, even if most of you don't. Know the origin of the term. To recap for those of you who slept through hyperdynamics, the P field allows for the warping of the curvature of space. Leave it to a Terran to find the hard road to a solution. Rather than simply redirecting or reflecting gravitons, Paragon figured out how to curve space in such a way that their paths accomplished the same goal, that of gravity manipulation. Paragon also discovered that, with a bit more energy, the curvature could become so extreme that he could seemingly connect 2 points of space without requiring traversal through the intervening space. He discovered the underlying mechanisms of quantum entanglement and tunneling, which particles engage in at their own energies and with their own limitations, but deliberate entanglement in a directed and controlled fashion resulting in tunneling through space, what we now refer to as the Levenshtein potential. At first, the system required the presence of a P-field manipulator at each end, carefully calibrated to connect with each other. Also, the early efforts only allowed for the transmission of electromagnetic waves between the points, and not more. Complex matter. The first thing Paragon did was insist on sticking a P-wave antenna that was connected to a similar one in his lab onto the tip of a satellite and ask it to be shot to a nearby star that they had named Alpha Centauri. The journey would take several octos. Remember, they did not yet have an FTL drive. The records show significant pushback from several major governmental branches on Terra, but ultimately it was seen as a useful test of several technologies. And the Centauri beacon was launched. Yes, Terrans had a third sublight craft leave their system and even reach a nearby star long before the Sol Veil fell. It used advances in electric propulsion gained as part of other efforts to reach a significant fraction of the local speed of light, allowing the Centaur beacon to cross interstellar space only slightly slower than light would for the journey, all the while controlled and directed via the P-field antenna, and constantly sending back new information gathered from beyond the veil. By the time the beacon reached its destination system, Paragon had led Terrans to not only develop a functional drive based on the antenna, but had successfully tested it within their own system, traversing from Earth to, initially, bases on Earth's satellite Luna, and later to colonies around the fourth planet, Mars. Work on their slipstream drive also continued and was near success, but it was seen primarily as an adjunct to what Terrans now referred to as a jump drive. Paragon himself gave it its formal name. The drive, provided a 4-dimensional manipulation of 3-dimensional space. As such, Paragon called it the Penrose Drive, after the Penrose Triangle, his favorite impossible geometry that he had now made possible. This is the fourth Terran anomaly, the Penrose Drive. Over time, it has been shorted to P-Drive, which many students mistakenly think refers to the same abbreviation as the P-field. How many people in this room knew the P-Drive originated on Earth? Pause. As I thought, only a few. Well, now you know, there is debate among scholars, especially Terran scholars regarding how much the Terran authorities knew about Paragon's efforts to build a jump-capable vessel. Some argue that the level of resource and time investment needed to create what became known as the Hermes exceeded even what a scientist like Paragon, even with species-wide support and fame, could commandeer in private, but there is conflicting evidence on the subject. As the Hermes itself is now permanently part of the Central Museum, you can tour the vessel and decide for yourselves. Since the 4th and 5th Terran anomalies are so intrinsically linked with the Hermes, it is worth discussing for a moment. The vessel was designed either as part of the ruse or simply for convenience depending on your position in the debate, as a tower in roughly the same style as Terran buildings at the time. Terran ship design has long been seen as esoteric, even considering some of the designs from aquatic species, and it is presumed that some of this eccentricity is a continuation of tradition stemming from the Hermes. The central structure is surrounded by 6 pylons connected by walkways and bridges, both to each other and to the central hub. The bridge, if it could be called such, occupies one complete level of the main structure, with full views to all sides. Immediately above the bridge is a large dome housing several telescopes and other analysis equipment. The Hermes is not a combat vessel. It was intended as a mobile space station. While it was equipped with shields, they were intended primarily to prevent damage from space debris and unanticipated EM emissions such as cosmic rays. Query. I've been asked why Terrans did not attempt to communicate with other species once discovered. Once it passed the veil, the Centauri beacon would have been able to send and receive any kind of signal, correct? This is where hyperdynamics meets xenosociology, and part of why I love leading this series. Space travel for most species focuses on the slipstream drive as the most accessible form of FTL travel. It's not my specialty, but it's elementary physics that slipstream drives use high power densities to warp space around a craft through matter-energy equivalence. This warping changes relative mass effects within its area of influence, allowing for both gravity manipulation and faster-than-light travel through mass negation. This is part of the irony of the development of the jump drive. Most species, in fact every species but Terrans, discover the reflection of gravitons first, as the instantaneous energy requirements are significantly lower than that needed to generate p-fields. I believe there has been convergent science to show that the slipstream is actually a partially formed p-field, but lacking a target. Since this solves the issues of both gravity manipulation and propulsion, most species stop there or pursue how increases in energy density can be used for improved motion. The idea of explicitly breaking a slipstream field and trying to pair it to something else goes against all established hyperdynamics theory. Interstellar communication is generally handled by the same basic system. Since signals have functionally no mass, they can be accelerated to extremely high speeds with very little energy. This is the basis for all pre-Terran communication systems. Now, of course, we all use P-wave communication. We're talking about prior to the Terran emergence, however, when the Federation had standardized on the beacon system. Terrans, of course, had their P-wave antenna and electromagnetic communications. But that was all. While someone outside of the system could eventually read EM signals, they would take multiple octas to reach the nearest inhabited Federation system. And even then, it's likely no one would have been looking for them. There are Terran records of government officials and scientific leaders discussing these options. It was decided by the Central Terran government to withhold any communications attempts until they were certain of their jump drive technology. In fact, one of the activities intended in Alpha Centauri was to set up a communications relay from which first contact could be initiated. Also remember that Terrans realized the veil existed, which meant that someone had put it there. There was always the outside possibility that said someone might be antagonistic, and so caution was seen as the better approach. This was a major point of contention in the debate around launching the Centauri beacon. Regardless, the Hermes was officially unveiled several months after the Centauri beacon reached Alpha Centauri. Several in-system jumps were made to test the ship and its new P-drive, which required only a targeting signal and not a paired antenna to generate a jump point. When the time came, Paragon and his crew targeted the signal of the Centauri beacon and activated their P-drive, and, as history has shown, jumped right into the 5th Terran anomaly. We'll stop here for the day. I know I asked you to review, 2 records. I was going to address them today, but I've managed to secure a special event for this series. Our next 2 sessions will be guest lectures given by the esteemed xenosociologist Diralin. Dismissed. Recording starts, background noises of seats, papers, low speaking. Well, it looks like we only lost about 10% of the class so far. I guess I didn't scare you enough yet. Today's lecture should fix that. Audience laughter, though uncomfortable. The Terran homeworld, Earth, as you should recall, is a death world. All background noises stop. I see that got your attention. Yes, we all know what that word means. A planet where certain geographic, astronomical, or other characteristics normally inimical to life can be found, yet life arose. Approximately 0.5% of known species are death world species, yet over half of extinct FTL civilizations are death worlders, including the Rotha, who were the first death worlders known to reach FTL and, after almost a rotation of nearly continuous war, the first FTL species known to be completely wiped out. The term death world is of course slang, though even minds as educated and informed as xenosociology professors use it, some chuckling from audience. The official term is environmentally hostile planet. There are 3 absolute characteristics that qualify a planet as an EHP, though others are considered as potentially contributing: significant axial tilt, significant gravity, and significant ionizing radiation. Significant gravity should be self-explanatory. Any planet with sufficiently high gravity at the surface is going to reduce the likelihood of life forming and, ultimately, of any life that may form to rise to spacefaring capability. What the definition of significant is, of course, is a little fuzzy, but the standard used is generally 1 grav. A death world is considered one where the average local gravity exceeds 1.5 gravs. Most death world species are high gravity. Species generally ranging between 1.5 and 1.9 gravs. It's been argued that the success of species up to 1.9 gravs should require a change of the standard. That's being discussed, but many high-grav species are against the change. They prefer to keep the title of Death Worlders, which might tell you something about the psychology of high-grav species. Subtle laughter. 4 species have reached space from a higher gravitational pull, with both the Julian and Tribert being aquatic species who developed at approximate 2.1 and 2.2 gravs, respectively. We're not entirely sure about the Rotha homeworld, as its destruction predates modern standards, but archaeology and historic documents suggest that it was between 2.1 and 2.4 gravs. A significant axial tilt is considered one between 10% and 90%. Planets with this characteristic result in seasonal variation of surface temperatures, in some cases having wide swings. Only 7 species have been known to develop on such planets, almost always in equatorial regions of icy worlds. Again, the Rotha homeworld is suspected of having a tilt of approximately 18%, the highest of any known death world species, which led to extreme weather conditions on their surface, and consequently, the ascension of a species that we know to have lived primarily underground. The final category is that of significant ionizing radiation. Such radiation has a proclivity for breaking chemical and molecular bonds, and thus, at even low levels, will stop life from developing in the first place. 4 species are known to have developed in such environments, generally with shorter lifespans and higher regenerative factors. As stated, there are other characteristics that can influence a planet and may suggest death world status. Some are minor factors that may contribute overall, such as extreme weather, unstable primaries, or regular bombardment from space debris. However, the prevalence of species with one or even a few of these characteristics suggests that they aren't individually useful for the EHP designation. Historically, only 1 species has arisen from a homeworld suspected of having 2 of the 3 primary death world criteria. That species is, of course, the Rotha, as previously mentioned. History also shows that the Rotha were, at least as recorded, the most violent and destructive species to ever reach FTL. Their campaign against the 5 was nearly successful, and only through the combined efforts and almost a full rotation of war did the 5 at last succeed in stopping the Rotha. Not defeating, as no Rotha is ever recorded as having surrendered, but ultimately obliterating every Rotha colony, including their home system. The original concern around death world species in fact dates back to the founding of the Federation and the designation of Central. One of the primal goals of Central is monitoring for DEATHWORLD species and preventing a repeat of the Rotha campaign. In 25 rotations, we've seemingly been lucky. The only other DEATHWORLDers to arise have been under the harsh conditions of one of the criteria, most often higher gravity. As you learned in SOC 117, this is theorized as limiting the violent potential of the species. Until relatively recently, we've had nothing against which to test this theory. Pause. Earth has all three. Audience gasps. I already told you that, due to the unique environment around its primary, Earth has been subject to numerous extinction events. I should mention that the Planetary Sciences Division here at the university considered adding this as a fourth qualifying criteria for a DEATHWORLD, but since Earth already qualified for the other three, it was deemed adding insult to injury. To use a Terran phrase, Earth's average gravity is about 2.5 gravs, higher than any other emergent species. This is mostly due to its size and existence as a rocky planet and not a moon. Of the 21 species we know to have developed on such inner planets, most are high-grav species due to this very reason. In fact, of the 4 rocky planets in Earth's system, 2 are below 1 grav and the third is at about 2.2 gravs. Even in their own neighborhood, Terran home gravity is high. The planet has an axial tilt of 13%, giving rise to significant swings in temperature outside its equatorial region. Only about 1 to 3 of the planet's surface, and slightly over that of its land, mass lies in this equatorial region. Outside of that region, the natural temperature of the planet ranges between 330 K and 180 K. Yes, there are parts of Earth where the element mercury would be a solid. While we have many examples of extremophile species near both ends of those spectrums, most homeworlds do not have both extremes at the same time. Additionally, this axial tilt gives rise to more energetic storms and severe weather than most worlds experience, though not to the point of being a life-limiting criteria. And finally, but certainly not least, Earth is the only known homeworld where radioactive elements are naturally present in significant quantities. Indeed, part of Terran history includes the use of these elements for both power generation and as weapons. Louder gasp, muttering, yes, they are the only known pre-FTL species to use fissionable weapons. On each other, no less, though I believe that was only twice. Only. Even prior to this, however, their planet was about 10 times as radioactive as any other homeworld, with most exposure coming from simply breathing in the air. The planet was so saturated with radioactive isotopes that the byproducts simply leached into the atmosphere and were present everywhere. We assume that Sol, the star around which Earth orbits, formed in the leftover remains from nearby supernovas. Astronomic records from before its formation give some credence to this theory, though that part of the galaxy has generally been less explored for various reasons. As stated, most life takes far longer to develop on planets, which means that any naturally occurring radioactive elements have long decayed. Earth's significant abundance and short history are the driving points for this condition. At this juncture, you're probably thinking that we've found the second Terran anomaly. You wouldn't be alone. I had that exact thought when I sat in those seats. But no, this is all just a precursor, and much of it is dependent on the first Terran anomaly. All we have said so far is additional context to the low probability of life, much less sentient life, arising on Earth. However, as your xenosociology professors should have ingrained in you, knowing the conditions in which life arose can tell you a lot about a species. As I said before, life evolved very quickly on Earth and multiple times due to the sheer hostility of the planet. There were dozens of extinction-level events, often occurring frequently enough in succession, that life only managed to reach basic multicellular development stages before being knocked back a few rungs on the developmental hierarchy. Even once complex life forms arose, several impacts and catastrophes killed off the more dominant forms and reverted life to more primitive stages. The result is that evolution on Earth did not follow a typical linear development, but instead backtracked, converged, diverged, and mutated more rapidly and inconsistently. The species that survived the most recent extinction events weren't necessarily the most hardy or the most advanced, but rather simply the beneficiaries of luck. Random chance once again. On more tame worlds, as in essentially every other homeworld in the galaxy, survival is a matter of cooperation, communal living, and overcoming the depredations of predators. It is generally, though not always, a highly cohesive and adaptable prey species that begins to use tools to fight for survival. Sometimes it is the predator species that manages to nearly wipe out its prey and thus develops technology as an alternative to instinctive hunting. Terrans aren't really either. Technically, they are a predator species, but they lack most of the characteristics of predators. No claws, no carapace, no extremely acute senses. They are, in fact, something of a failed predator species. A common Terran joke refers to their species as primates who fell out of trees a lot, but it's not entirely a joke. On this thrice-damned death world with its multiple mass extinctions and radioactive environment, Terrans turned to technology because they were too badly adapted to thrive in any other way. They weren't even the first species on their planet to do so. A distant relative began using tools before them, but that species was likely too accommodating, and eventually the early Terrans wiped them out. If anything, this makes Terrans more terrifying than predators. Most predators hunt for food and are quiescent otherwise. The transition to spacefaring civilization is generally easy, as long as they aren't threatened or hungry. Terrans have all the anxiety and insecurities inherent to prey species, along with the viciousness and cunning of a predator. Again, this wouldn't generally be an issue, as to reach space and emergence, a society has to come together. That is even more true on a high-grav, extreme-weather, radioactive death world. But Terrans aren't normal, or we wouldn't be having this class. Most spacefaring species develop on satellites around large primaries. The primary acts as an ever-present cultural and sociological touchpoint, often becoming the central deity, or figure in local myths and religion. Indeed, 98% of spacefaring races have, at one point or another, had exactly this kind of monotheistic belief based around their primary body. Such a spatial position also gives easy awareness of, and eventually, access to other satellites around the primary. These often form the basis of servants or other lower beings who work for or serve the primary deity. Given the additional propensity for prey species to have communal societies focused on collective effort, these lead to religions focused on participation of all together under the watchful eye of their chief god. But Terrans evolved on an inner world. Their primary body was close enough to be more than a bright star, but still simply formed a small disk in the sky. Likewise, their one satellite, Luna, was, by random chance, a phrase you'll hear a lot in this series, almost the same size in their sky. This led to a tendency to form not monotheistic systems, but dualistic systems. And once you have two, it is easy to have more. Most religions on Earth were dualistic or polytheistic. Even if individual groups worshipped one or another god primarily, they almost all agreed that other gods existed. Competition between the worshippers of these different gods formed a major part of Terran history, and even their socio-political structures ended up being almost universally focused on the resulting conflicts. Even Terrans themselves as a species incorporated this kind of duality into their psyche, thinking in terms of good versus evil, Terran versus nature, us versus them. This is a kind of social history that is largely unprecedented in any other culture. Even in species who had divisive civil wars and insurgencies, there was always an inherent commonality between all sides that forced a basic level of respect. This is, in fact, the underlying psychological basis for the Federation's rules on warfare, in which it is normal and expected for any side to surrender after a decisive loss of 10 to 20% of their forces. For a communal or cooperative species, a war in which a significant portion of either side dies is, after all, a war against oneself. Terrans do not have this innate connection to each other. The basis for this is a fundamental tribalism, a word unique to Terran history, though there are approximate analogues in other cultures. In essence, Terran biology is such that, at a fundamental instinctive level, they identify only those members of their local family group as being equals. Over time, this identification became more malleable as definitions of local family group evolved and expanded, but the critical factor is that a Terran can actively choose whom to include or exclude. They readily and easily divide and subdivide themselves along various axes that to the rest of the Federation seem absurdly trivial. Skin pigmentation, political allegiance, preference for specific recreational activities. The confusing part is how these various divisions can overlap and change at a moment's notice. Terrans are not wholly barbaric, of course. They know this of themselves and decided, as a group, to try and minimize the level of atrocity they would commit to each other. The aforementioned use of fission weapons was one event that helped catalyze this agreement, but it was not alone. And lest you leave this room thinking otherwise, it is critical that you realize what this says about Terran psychobiology. As I said, every other species has a built-in tendency towards lenience and tolerance of their own kind. Terrans are the only FTL species in galactic history that we've observed to actively choose a broader morality. It is not a biological imperative. It is not a trait bred over multiple rotations. The decision to include other species or individuals in the grouping of us and afford them equal agency and self-determination is an active choice that each Terran makes. This tendency even gives rise to some endearing habits that are nonetheless peculiar by galactic standards. We'll discuss the concept of anthropomorphization later. This is the second Terran anomaly, which a Xenosox termed aesthetic. Morality. A species born on a thrice-cursed death world, at the heart of a chaotic and violent system, neither as predator nor prey but some twisted combination of the two, actively chose to engage in a moral and ethical system that, to be blunt, made the rules of warfare and non-combat concessions in the Federation, before their emergence, look like crude rules in a childish game. Not from instinct, not from evolution, not from imposition from the outside, but because they saw the alternative and decided that a broader morality and reciprocal altruism was preferred. This often leads to a question of, what if they should someday decide otherwise? Or what happens if their version of ethics conflicts with another species' approach? The only answer one can give here is history. There is a reason why a large section of the Central Archive on Moral and Ethical Dilemmas, Conflict Resolution, and De-escalation are translated from the Terran political language. The first Terrans holding official positions in the Federation, in fact, demanded to help rewrite and redesign all the rules of engagement for first contact situations. To this day, the United Terran Systems exists only as an ally to the Federation and not a full member, with the distinction being that Terrans have a right of refusal to engage in any Federation efforts, a right that has so far never been exercised, and I personally fear the day that the Federation drifts so far from our core principles that the Terrans would feel the need. In the words of Terran President Mayim during the signing of the Charter, we refuse to place ourselves and our progeny in the position of being forced to support an unethical act, or to stand by while others are subjected to barbarism. We've seen where that leads, and we owe it to our ancestors to never let it happen again. As I said, Terrans know their limits and propensities more than anyone else, and develop their own ways to police and judge their actions, including in comparison to competing ethical systems. Slight chuckle. It is appropriate, in a way, that the galaxy's experts on morality are a species that was not inclined to it by nature. The objective correlative is always needed. Remember that. I expect you to review your texts on astrodynamics, and refresh your knowledge of veil operations. Both will be critical for the next session. Dismissed. Sounds of general activity before the recording cuts off. Recording starts. Background noises of seats, papers, low speaking. Welcome back, students. Our galaxy has existed for approximately 60 galactic rotations, depending on how you count things. The first sentient species to place records in the archives are the 6 elder species, 5 of which came together to defeat the Rotha and form what would later become the Federation. At the time, their primary goal was preventing another such disaster and, to the best of their abilities, saving as much information about Rotha culture and history as possible. For this specific purpose, the Central Systems were selected and designated permanently neutral territory, and within the systems, the Central Archives. We now approach the midline of the 25th galactic rotation since that founding, and I believe there are extensive celebrations planned for Mid-Rota. In those 25 rotations, an additional 1,607 species have reached FTL status. We mark the transition to FTL technology as the point at which a species has matured enough to be ready for interspecies contact. This is a designation made in the 18th rotation, after the culture war and mass suicide of the Kaluk shortly after achieving FTL capability as the 1,043rd species. To prevent any other such contamination in the future, the Federation made the Non-Interference Pact, which has been agreed to by every member species since. The pact designated that systems with the precursors for sentience or early sentient species were to be documented and considered off-limits for colonization. Since its passing, over 5,000 such systems have been identified. Luckily, there is no shortage of stars in the galaxy. Audience laughter. Originally, all species were expected to devote resources to patrolling and maintaining the pact within their own designated regions of space. Early into the 23rd rotation, the Veil project was begun to automate the process. As you all should have reviewed, the Veil is an electromagnetic filter that is enacted outside the heliosphere of any system identified as having the traits deemed amenable to an emergent species. Thousands of independent drones are released outside the heliosphere and, drawing on emissions from the system's own primary, generate a redundant, overlapping field that actively strips all electromagnetic spectrum signals that would be indicative of other spacefaring races. As you know, the purpose of the Veil is twofold. First, it serves to protect the nascent species from inadvertent interference. No signals can be received, no indications of other species, no, say, accidentally watching the gods fight battles on your doorstep, and lose. The Caloose taught us that one. No, the idea is to allow a species to develop wholly on its own until it is culturally, technologically, and politically ready to join the Federation. What do we consider ready to join the Federation? The use of a faster-than-light drive. As I said in the last session, the cumulative efforts generally required of a civilization to reach FTL capability imply that several major cultural milestones have been reached. Additionally, at the point of developing their own drive, the only options left are to either accept the species as equals or to forcibly strip them of that capability if possible. Ironically, the Rotha Xenocide has been cited by factions arguing for pursuit of both options, especially in the cases of seemingly violent emerging species, but the Federation has always opted for diplomacy. The second purpose of the Veil is thus to monitor for FTL drives in all forms known and detectable, and to notify Central when such a flight is detected. The Federation can then send a first contact delegation to the system to meet with the species in question, deactivate the Veil, and begin their integration into the Federation. Note that I said, in all forms known and detectable. This language was added as a concession to facts several octas after the Terran emergence. Later in the 23rd rotation, automated FTL drones were developed to make the search for, identification of, and isolation of nascent species easier. Multiple species in the Federation were complaining about the resources such identification missions consumed. So, from the mid-23rd rotation to the present, deployment and monitoring of the Veil system has been almost entirely automated. Back to Terrans. Last time, we discussed the second Terran anomaly, their morality. Even after making the non-atrocity agreement between their factions, Terrans were still in competition with each other, even while not being in active warfare, which still happened, of course, but with certain limitations and general agreements. One such competition became utilization of the space around Earth, for military purposes, of course, but also as a kind of proof of skill and achievement. You see, with a multi-theistic social modality and no large primary in their sky to obscure them, early Terrans began to explore their system, visually at first, then with more complicated telescopes. While most other species first utilized their space efforts at gathering resources from their neighboring satellites around their primary, Terrans began their space program primarily for military purposes and in a race to explore. They actively identified and discovered most of the major bodies in their system long before they reached orbit of their own planet. Terran space exploration relied on their weapons systems as a starting point, but their weapons systems were some of the most advanced aspects of their civilization, primitive by general standards, of course. But remember that this is a species that evolved extremely rapidly on a relatively young death world. Early on, crude rockets powered by oxidation, reactions from complex carbon chains were used to reach orbit, and eventually their satellite and beyond. Such chemical systems were extremely limited in what they could do alone, of course, but if you remember nothing else from this course, remember to never underestimate a Terran. During the race to land Terrans on their satellite Luna, one group of Terrans discovered something remarkable about their system. Remember those 4 large gaseous outer planets? Shortly before reaching their own satellite, a Terran scientist discovered that they would be in a specific orientation in about 20 of Earth's own rotations about its primary. That's about 10 octos for those who need a comparison. At that time, the outer planets would be aligned such that a chemically powered craft could use gravitational acceleration around them to visit all 4 gas planets, something that otherwise wasn't possible at all using the technology of the time. This alignment would only come about once every 100 octos, about 200 years. The leading space exploration group at the time took this as a challenge and pushed their technology development enough to make such a craft. 2, in fact. Last session, I also mentioned anthropomorphization. This is a Terran word for their tendency to assign Terran characteristics, personality, behavior, even affection to other species and even inanimate objects. As part of that strange Terran habit, they held a competition and named their 2 spacecraft Voyager 1 and Voyager 2. In another of those idiosyncratic quirks that Terrans are to this day known for, they actually launched Voyager 2 first. The missions themselves were dubbed the Grand Tour. The satellites had separate trajectories that utilized slingshots on the 2 larger gas planets to increase their energies, while Voyager 2's mission profile also included visits to the 2 smaller gas giants. The journeys themselves would take multiple octos, traveling at well below light speeds. In fact, it took 12 Earth years for Voyager 2 to complete its intended mission to the 7th and 8th planets, while Voyager 1 passed their 5th and 6th planets in about 3 years. However, Terrans did not want to give up their toys, as it were, and both satellites were retasked for continued exploration. With no additional bodies to interfere with them, both satellites eventually passed the system's heliopause and entered interstellar space. Subtle chatter. So some of you are still awake and paying attention. You can see where this is leading. This chance observation of a chance alignment of the planets allowed Terrans to achieve something no other species had ever been known to do: extrasolar exploration without an FTL drive. Current estimations are that it was a literal 1 in a million occurrence for a sentient species. The right alignment, 1 in 200, the right observation, 1 in 100, and the right technological level, 1 in 50. There will likely never be such an occurrence again for a pre-FTL species in the future of the galaxy. Approximately 30 octos after first landing on their homeworld's own satellite, the Terran satellite Voyager 1 passed into the field of the veil surrounding their system. Its velocity meant it reached the other side in approximately 1 Earth day, at which point it stopped relaying any information, of course. Terrans were, like most pre-FTL societies, still relying on electromagnetic communication systems. But for that 1 Earth day, Voyager 1 sent back to Earth observations of galactic civilization that the species wasn't supposed to see. 3 octos later, Terrans were ready and waiting when Voyager 2 did likewise, confirming their first observations. So the third Terran anomaly we term the Grand Tour, that exceedingly improbable event that led Terrans to discovering the existence of the Veil and of galactic civilization without FTL capacity. Try to imagine what that was like. A pre-FTL species, still trying to explore its own solar system, still trying to survive on a death world, still fighting among itself over social and political differences. And then, suddenly, having a glimpse at species and civilizations that are so far beyond your own that you can only barely grasp some of what you observe. What would you do? What would your species have done? We know the answers to that, unfortunately. Mostly, they self-destruct. The Kalu were unique in their extreme, in that the whole civilization committed mass suicide, but there are over 20 recorded examples of pre-FTL species who, when exposed to galactic civilization, suffered mass hysteria and the socio-political equivalent of a psychotic breakdown. 17 of those worlds still have large swaths that are uninhabitable due to the chemical, biological, or radioactive results of wars. We have one example of the other extreme. The Rotha, upon observing an Olaki exploration vessel in a system approximately midway between their 2 civilizations, reacted to the existence of at least one other spacefaring species, as they had to other species in the past. The Rotha viewed the Olakis as competition for limited resources, and summarily began a campaign to exterminate the Olakis as they had all other competing species on the Rotha homeworld. We all know how that turned out. Pause. Slight cough. The Veil project was implemented precisely to prevent either of these kinds of situations from happening, but no system is perfect. If the project had still been utilizing live observation and monitoring craft, it's possible the Voyager launches and eventual escapes could have been detected and somehow accounted for, but even that would have required a lucky break. With automated monitoring restricted to FTL signatures, there was no chance of intercepting the satellites before they breached. As it was, the Federation didn't even learn of these events until over a septa after they happened. But now, I'm getting ahead of myself. Yes. A question? Yes. Yes. Your colleague asks what became of the 2 Voyager probes. Terran psychology is interesting. I already mentioned that they have a tendency to assign sentient traits to inanimate objects. That is probably an understatement of the kind of pack bonding or emotional commitment that Terrans can and regularly do make to things. I'm sure many of you know jokes about the subject. One of the quirks of pre-Terran FTL society was the heavy use of machines to explore their system and nearby planets. Again, that high gravity as well as their distance from any of their planetary neighbors denied them the casual ease with which most sentient species take their first steps skyward. Earth was too far away given their basic propulsion systems to keep a Terran alive for the full journey. Other societies might be willing to sacrifice the lives of a few individuals in such exploration, but that unique Terran morality comes back into play here as well, and they were unwilling to do so in most cases. Instead, they sent remote-controlled machines with various levels of self-automation to do their exploring for them. As any student of Terran psychology would expect, they became attached to these machines, even having them mimic Terran birth celebrations or major events, and in a few cases, holding the equivalent of memorial or funeral services for machines that were no longer functional. One of the first activities Terrans did after achieving real spaceflight was to retrieve many of these machines and enshrine them in museums or permanent statues. For example, 2 small wheeled robots had been sent to the 4th planet, and one was cleaned, returned to Earth, and placed in what for most species would be an extravagant tomb. The other was left in situ, surrounded by the strongest transparent materials, and kept in its state, including the bit of ground on which it had been resting, while the rest of the planet's surface was modified for habitation. I've been lucky enough to have seen both impersonal visits to the Sol system, and I have to tell you that while I do not understand the Terran emotional attachment to the machines, I think I grasp some of the importance Terrans place on those small machines, and others like them. As for the 2 Voyager probes, part of the charter agreement between the Federation and the United Terran Systems is a binding clause that states that no Federation member is to ever interfere with their movement in any way. Yes, they're still out there, drifting at sublight, velocities through galactic space. There are Terran individuals constantly monitoring them to ensure they pose no threat or hazard. Their trajectories have been calculated to extremely high precision for the rest of this rotation, and they don't appear to be at risk of encountering any other system before they leave the galaxy. The Terrans insist they be left alone to continue their journeys in peace. Has anyone encountered the Terran phrase, "through hardships to the stars"? Yes, many of you, as you say, it's the motto of the UTS. It's also used as something of a rallying cry for Terrans, an expression of determination and willingness in pursuit of some larger goal. The UTS adopted that phrase from materials included on the Voyager satellites as part of the first Terran attempt at communication with the universe beyond their system, long before they knew there was anyone to communicate with. Momentary silence. Returning to our subject, Terran society was given 2 short peeks into the galaxy beyond the Veil and discovered that there was in fact a lot out there. But no, the Terrans didn't go mad. Their civilization didn't collapse. Never underestimate a Terran. No, what happened instead led directly to the 4th and 5th Terran anomalies. We're out of time, so I'll end here. I'm noting 2 archive records for you to observe before the next lecture. They're short, so please pay attention to them. Thanks for diving into this story with me. Don't miss out on the next one. Hit that subscribe button, give this video a big thumbs up, and drop a comment below with your thoughts. I'd love to hear what you think.